So the impact of the water has been pretty recent because they've been, they're just getting closer to me now. I think it impacted me before I really realized it. So one of my main sources of water is a solar well that's on top of the mountain. It's a perched aquifer, and several years ago, the well wasn't as producing as much, and I was starting to run short of water for the cattle. But it was also dry at the same time, and so and you can't really the way the water comes out. It's called a pitless adapter, and it comes out through a pipe, so you can't really see the flow, which so then you're just not really too super aware of how much the well is actually producing, and it pumped into a big storage pit, and so I would try to get that storage pit filled way ahead of time, but so they're drinking out of the pit, not just directly out of the well. And a couple of years ago, it was kind of later in the late summer. I just wasn't getting enough water for the cows, and because they were not really that close, I didn't want to cry wolf. That I think, well, it might be affecting my water, or it could be just maybe it's because it's drier, or it was hot and the cows are drinking more. But I went ahead and I didn't have enough water for the cows, and Ellen had sold her cows and hadn't sold the ranch yet, so she had some pasture available. So I actually moved the cows off for a couple, early off. So there was a couple months of grazing that I didn't get, but I just wasn't sure what was happening. And then, so after we were gone, I had the well filling the pit, and it wasn't filling very fast, but I still, just wasn't sure. And then basically left it filling all winter because it's just solar and underground and you can do that. And then went back early in the spring, and I was just totally shocked because the pit didn't have a hell of a lot more water in it than when I left. And so that's when I got, it was well, something's definitely going on here. And so I was more suspicious that it's probably is mine related because, I kept looking for leaks in the pipeline, looking for leaks in the pit, or, where, why isn't this well producing? And so at some point and then I was getting kind of panicky because this is in the spring, and I'm going to have to be coming up there with the cows pretty soon. And, there's not enough water. And I guess this is the other side of it is I used to have two major sources of water, the well and then lower down was a spring. And Signal Peak tore out my water development, the spring, and tore out all my storage pits. So then I was just really dependent on that well. And so I called DEQ, and they said, well, if you've got a problem, make a citizen's complaint. And so I filed a citizen's complaint, and then they set up a time to come out, and they told Signal Peak was there, and Signal Peak got basically a well maintenance guy. And so we all met up there, and to basically try to determine, one, could it be a problem with the pump? And I'd already pretty much figured it out myself that it wasn't the pump. We pulled up the pump and checked it. So so everybody came, and then in the process, my solar collector is right over the well. So that was part of, in order to pull the pump out and check the pump, we had to move the solar collector. And that was kind of basically ordered by DEQ, and then Signal Peak kind of carried that out. And then they pulled up the pump and determined the pump wasn't a problem. And so DEQ then kind of reviewed their monitoring data on their monitoring wells, and they did notice that as the last panel moved by there, that it did affect the monitoring wells. So they made a preliminary kind of decision that, it definitely could be mining that's affecting the well. And the well was, I never knew exactly what it pumped, but it was about 6 gallons a minute, I think. Well, that's what the pump pumped, and that was what it had been previously. And when the well driller checked it, and again, he came up with the same thing that we did. It was a little under a gallon a minute that it was producing. So it's way down. And so they did a preliminary deal that it could be, and so Signal Peak had to do something to supply me with water while they made a more thorough determination. And I suggested this is like, it's hauling water is like, there's lots of drawbacks to it, and it's expensive, and the water quality they haul me isn't as good. So the spring they tore out, I said, well, if you put that back in, we can use that, pump the water up, and use that as some of the water replacement, temporary water replacement. But I made it very clear that putting the spring back in is not going to replace my well. I need both those sources. So they did redevelop the spring that they tore out and kind of got it set up where they could pump it up. And as much as possible, I let them use that for water replacement, but also said if it's not enough, I need, you're going to have to haul water. And I think eventually it was kind of a combination of them hauling water and using the spring. But, and then DEQ made a final determination. And what they determined was there was basically two causes that affected the well. One was, they said it was affected by mining, and two, they said it was probably affected by my over pumping the well, which was probably true. But the reason I had to over pump the well is because they tore my spring out. So I was kind of in a dilemma, but they made a determination, and then they came up with, kind of based on, I'm not sure what, but just kind of what they thought my cattle would need. They came up with like a figure, I think it was 25,000 gallons a week, which on the average, like over the whole summer, that would probably work. But, the average doesn't work with cows. And so I did the kind of math, and like on a hot day, a cow-calf pair can drink up to 30 gallons. And so if you multiply out that by the number of cows I had, there would be times that was coming up short. So DEQ made that order, and then once they make the order, they really can't back off or change it. So I challenged I said, like in the meantime, yeah, bring me my 25,000 gallons, but I'm challenging the order because that's not really, they're supposed to replace it in like kind, like quantity, and the way I could store that water, it wasn't as much water that I had before. And so, but then the Signal Peak mine also challenged the order, saying that it was all caused by me and it wasn't caused by mining at all. And so, so there's two challenges to the DEQ's order. But neither Signal Peak or I actually we challenged it, but we never actually took it to court. I think both of us didn't really want to kind of do that. But then the other thing that was really made it difficult was Signal Peak took the position that any water that I pumped from the spring that they reinstalled would count against the water they had to haul. And that just it didn't work, because that spring, I already needed that spring, and they were trying to say the spring's going to replace the water they had to haul, and the order was very clear that they had to haul that water. And so, they were refusing to haul any more water, and I was running out of water, so I had to go to DEQ and have them order them to haul the water. And of course, that made them mad, so then they disconnected the spring where I couldn't use it. And, it really put me in a bind because I didn't have enough water for the cows. And, finally kind of Signal Peak backed off and allowed me to reconnect the spring and to use that. But, it was totally, this was during really hot weather where like day by day, I just didn't know if I was going to have enough water. And so, the idea behind, the laws that govern this is that they have to replace that water in a timely fashion. And, just one way or the other, just Signal Peak being just punitive and basically just trying to make it, or just make it so miserable for me I couldn't run cattle there. Between that and then some of the DEQ decisions is not really lining up with what I needed, is like the whole idea behind the law that we were going to have water for our cattle, that all just got out the window, and that just, totally should never have happened. If the law says if they damage your water, they have to make sure your cattle have water, and and I had to fight them every step of the way to do that, and and it cost me with the cow. I had to change my grazing practices. It was DEQ ruled that they were responsible at least partly for the water damage, and then what the mine should have done is they should have bent over backwards to make sure that everything was right. And instead of that, they just were just aggressive in any way possible to make it really hard for me. And that's not right. It shouldn't be allowed to happen, and the mine shouldn't be able to get away with it. So.
Yeah, I think you kind of noted it, and but it's just kind of reiterating it. But so, if you were a landowner or a property owner in the Bull Mountains, what would you suggest to do right? What do they need to do now?
Well, I think I could be pretty accurate on my springs, on if there was something more going on than being dry, but. I just don't know, come down to a court case or something, or, it would be one thing if the mine, you would think the mine would give you the benefit of the doubt at that point. They really should. It shouldn't be, and it's, with the amount of money they spend on other things, water replacement isn't that, it's something they could do. And maybe be a little generous at it, but that's just and it kind of surprises me. But I think it's just their attitude is they've got the power and they're the ones that should be there, and we shouldn't be. And I think if you're in the path of that mine, one way or the other, you should be kind of really aware of what their past behavior has been, and it's not been good. That's the real problem, is like with that perched aquifer, that in the Bull Mountains that we use a lot. That's a really unique source of water, and it's class 1 water. It's as good as water gets, and if that's destroyed, it's almost irreplaceable. The only way that you could get that water quality back would be if they treated it, and that should be what they're required to do, because it's like you have to replace this with like kind and like quantity. But if they have to replace a spring with like a really deep well, like a spring is like a perpetual motion machine. It's basically free. There's no, you may have to develop that spring, but there's no pumping cost. There's not a lot of maintenance cost. If they replace that with a really deep well, is like, that well could probably exceed $100,000 to drill it. And then if it's really deep like that, it's not something a landowner could do. I mean, like our wells now, we can do that work ourselves or get neighbors to help or something. But on a really deep well, you're going to have to hire that done at really great expense. And so, that's the other thing we've never really been satisfied on is if they did water replacement and have to do that and have to treat it, there has to be some kind of trust fund to fund that, because once they've closed that mine down, they are gone. There's you can't go back and say, hey, you said you were going to replace my water, because they're going to be long gone. So anything of water replacement that's going to cost money has to be done ahead of time. That money has to be secured some way. And we've brought this up to DEQ many, many times, and we've never got a real satisfactory. It's kind of like, well, we can't do anything until the damage occurs. And then the damage occurs, well, that might be like when they're leaving and when they're gone, and so I think that's something that people got to think about is it's not it's not easy to replace good water, and it's if they have to haul it, or it's going to be very expensive, and that those costs are going to only be covered if there's some kind of mechanism to set that up into forever. I mean, because who knows if these things will come back or not. And like the water in a lot of the water is going to drain down into what they call the gob, after they've mined through it, and that water quality is probably never going to be usable. So there's a major part of it that they're basically making unusable. And so you're either going to have to, hopefully the perched aquifers will repair themselves, or you're going to have to drill deep down below it. And that water quality is really probably not good. And, and there's not a lot known about it. And there's not even a lot known about how much is there or where it's there. And that's like when they do these environmental impact statements, they hire people, the mine hires people to make those predictions. And we've always just thought their predictions have been awfully optimistic and not really backed up by a lot of facts or data. And so one thing is, what happens when that mine pool fills up of that water in the gob, and it will either overflow somewhere, and then where it will probably overflow is out of the mine mouth and then go down Half-Breed Creek, I think it is. And that's, if it does that water coming out of there is going to be polluted, and nobody's ever addressed who's responsible for that, what's it's going to do. And then if it doesn't overflow, that means it's leaking, because there's water going into there. It's either got to overflow or it's going to seep out through the sides. And if it seeps out through the sides, then that's also going to be contaminating water. So, those are just like major things that haven't been addressed. And then, as far as the water coming back, I think there's some possibilities that will, but I think there's some real possibilities that won't. And like on those springs and perched aquifers, like the reason, like the spring that I really used up the perched aquifer is it came out in a crack in the sandstone, so it came out really in one place and made it easy to develop. The spring right over in the next draw just comes out in a huge big seep area, and it's it's probably almost as quantity as water, but you can't. It's really difficult to develop, and so if water that was formerly like a good spring that came out, if it comes out over a whole hillside and just makes a big wet spot, is like, yeah, well, the water came back, but it's not usable. So that's another kind of major problem of like, is the land going to be able to support livestock? And that's the one thing you got to have with livestock is water. And water is a short thing in eastern Montana, and it's not abundant in the Bull Mountains, but it's been good enough where you could run a ranching operation there. And the whole idea of our mining laws was like, they said, yes, you can have mining, but if you damage things, you've got to put it back. And that's the fundamental of kind of why they were allowed to mine, because they've been granted this huge privilege to be able to go in and do that stuff, and it wasn't there. A lot of it was federal coal, and so the premise was there were kind of two premises: is cattle and coal can coexist, and a lot of the things were based on that and the water replacement, and that's what we kind of questioned that, but that's what they said. We will protect you where cattle and coal will coexist even while they're mining, and that when they're done, the land is going to be usable again, because coal it might be like lots of tax money for a short period of time, but the productivity of that land over the long time outweighs all that. Because if you ruin something forever, that is a huge loss. That's a productive place. It's a place people can make a living, and it's a place you can produce food. And they absolutely should not be allowed to do permanent damage. And that's why I've just always felt really strongly I wanted to stay in the Bull Mountains and stay ranching there just to make sure those promises were kept. And and they know if they can get rid of us, it's way harder to enforce those laws and make sure that's if there's nobody there to complain, it's the history of it's been is that they can just do the damage and leave and not be held responsible. And I think that's what we really got to be our bottom line, is one way or the other, whether we might not be able to stay there, but one way or the other we need to kind of like ensure that land is put back. It might not be able to be as good as it was before or as nice, but it's got to be where it will support people and livestock. I don't think there's ever been a mine that's closed down that hasn't gone bankrupt, because they're gonna get away with try to avoid as much expense and responsibility as possible. So no, I don't know of any company that ever just shut down and kind of like paid all their bills, and that's exactly what they do, and everybody knows it. It's expected. So the only possible way that anybody's going to be protected is through bonding, or it goes into these bankruptcy courts, and then they start dividing it up between all the people they owe money to. And what's the case in Wyoming's been is like the workers get screwed. They you know, they try to short the the amount of money to reclaim, and so the only way to prevent that is bonding. And we talk to them endlessly about DEQ and bonding, but it's never. I've never felt really reassured that they've got it under control, and especially like with these wells, they bonded for like a couple wells, and then they're the amount they bonded is not realistic to what it's going to cost to drill these deep wells, or if there's got to be some kind of water treatment. So it's still a big problem. And then if they leave, then the state is like responsible. The state's supposed to come up with this money to do this, but it's questionable whether the state's going to have the money to do it adequately, and if that happens and this taxpayer is stuck with it, I mean, that's just going to be the biggest injustice that ever was. And it's not like the state's got an endless amount of money. It is like, it's more likely to happen. It's just not going to get done, even though the state should. They are the ones that are ultimately responsible to see that it's done. That's why it's got to be done now. Once they go, and we don't have any idea when Signal Peak, is like. It could be tomorrow morning that they are just totally gone out of there. And like with the well that they damaged up on top, they said, well, they don't have to replace that well until they mine under it, and then it's a year after they mine under it. So what could theoretically happen is the mine could shut down now, and they would never mine under it, and there's nothing to trigger if they never mine under it and just suspend the permit, that's what the other thing they do. They never give up a permit, they just suspend it. And the state's been known to, even in the Bull Mountains, even a permit that was suspended, they went and reinstated it through an act of the legislature. So what's very, I don't know if it's likely, but it could likely happen, is that mine could not mine under my well, and there's nothing to trigger that they'd ever have to do permanent water replacement. So they differentiate between temporary and permanent water replacement, but it's like, my temporary water replacement has been 2 years now. Who knows? It might be temporary for 10 years, and then the requirements of the water, like on permanent, they say they have to replace in like kind and like quantity. In temporary, it's like, well, just whatever a cow will drink without dropping over dead. And then they really haven't addressed the like quantity either. They're kind of saying the quantity is based on how much my cows drank versus, my idea is kind of like, if they're replacing quantity, it's how much the well produced, not how much my cows drink, because I use that water for anything. And so those are all the kind of gray areas that we can really get a lot of damage from. No, these are just things unknown, but aquifers are kind of big, and just because there's a line of the permit area and the non-permit area, the aquifer doesn't know that, and then with the water quality is, if the source of their water is coming from some of those mined out areas, it's very likely to affect the quality. So yeah, the water doesn't respect permit lines. Right. So one thing to understand about the Bull Mountains, and it was something, an injustice, something that shouldn't have happened over 100 years ago when they put the railroad, the Northern Pacific Railroad, the railroad that runs through Billings, when they put it in, they gave the railroad every other square mile for 50 miles of the railroad track, all the way, both sides of the railroad track. They gave them the surface and the minerals, and then which that was just a scandal at the time. It was the robber barons. I'm sure they paid off whoever they had to pay off to get that, and they built the railroad up north, the Great Northern. Didn't get anything. The Milwaukee didn't get anything, and then the other just total injustice about that. It was supposed to be to supply with service of the railroad, and the minute they got the railroad in, they just started. The service was not good. They just did what was very profitable. If they had spur lines they didn't like, they took them out. They were supposed to supply rail passenger service. So they not only got way more than what they should have, they didn't live up to their end of the bargain. But anyway, that's where all this starts, with this checkerboard land pattern. And when they gave them a checkerboard, they basically gave them control over all of it. Like these ranches and things. I mean, they're in a hole, and if somebody owns every other section, and then with the way the mining laws were written by the mining companies back in that same time period, it basically, if you owned land in that checkerboard pattern as a deeded landowner, you were in a very bad position. So on our ranch, we ran it for years, paid our leases, before the mining came. We didn't pay a whole lot of attention of like, well, this is this, when we developed the water, and there really wasn't anybody around that cared or to answer to. So we developed springs and put them in, and so we developed a spring on that was part of the, was originally owned by the railroad and then eventually owned by whoever owns them. It's not the mine, somebody else owns them. But so we developed a spring and had a really extensive storage system, and and it was a really eloquent way to water because it's a perched aquifer. We could put this gravity flow pipeline in, get the cows up off the creek on the benches because we could run water, high up. And so at some point I got this notice from the mine that they were, that I hadn't gotten the correct permission to put the spring in, and they were going to tear it out. And I attempted to try to talk to them about it, and there was one of the mine leadership who said, yeah, well, I'll see if we can, and they never called me back. And then I'd get another letters threatening, saying they're going to come tear it out. And frankly, I mean, I guess it's kind of like the invasion of Ukraine is like, they never, they kind of, well, they're not going to really do this. That's just kind of beyond imagination. And then one day it was 95 degrees. I went up there, and here's this big excavator tearing out my spring and the water storage. And in doing that, they tore out the pipeline where my cattle were watering. I hadn't been up there for a couple of days. My cattle were out of water. And then, so that's when I had to start using I kind of reconnected and had to use the solar well, and it wasn't really enough, but I could juggle things around. And then I immediately asked them, is like, part of the contract says it says I have the right to use the water, and then if I develop the spring, I have to have an approved plan. So I went and I got the or the NRCS to set up a good way to develop a spring. Got that, and they refused to let me put it in. And I should have sued them right at the time, but I figured, well, that, if I start suing them, it's going to cost me like probably $30,000-$40,000. And so I thought, well, maybe I can just get by with the well on top and eventually maybe get them to agree to let me redevelop that spring. And then in the meantime, they killed my well, and then they redeveloped the spring. But and I'm still probably going to go up there this summer, but I just went up there, and the generator they put there is now gone. So it's like, I'm going to be back. Are they going to be like, am I going to have to go to court to get them to let me kind of use that spring again? So I mean, it's just it's that you wouldn't think a company would do that, and it's just this particular company has proven to be just like totally disregard laws, disregard people. They just have a toxic attitude of that they don't really care about anybody else, and they're going to do what they want to do, and apparently they're not worried about bad publicity. But they should be, because one thing they're getting is they don't pay as much property tax as I do. I mean, they pay more, but their percentage is they get a big break on it. And the legislature gave them that. So, why should they be giving this company that's not treating people right tax breaks? And why should they even consider giving them more permits when they're already being responsible? Now they want to be permitted to like double the size of the mine. But if the company's not going to be responsible of doing what they should do as far as water replacement and all these things they do, and the way they treat people, is they shouldn't be kind of going and asking the favor of like getting a permit. And so at some point, I think we need to kind of get that mind to realize that they just can't act as irresponsible and then expect to get all the privileges they get from the state and federal government.
What motive did the mine have for ruining your spring? Like, what would they get out of it?
It was revenge, mostly.
Mm-hmm.
Revenge, and then just, figured they'll just run me out of there. But, it was, I think what it was is like they were mad over the MEIC and Sierra Club lawsuit challenging them on the permit. But I kind of think the other thing is like they knew with the contract we had to sign with them because of the checkerboard pattern, they knew that we're not in a very strong position, that they can do us a lot of damage. And I think that their attitude is like somebody in your position shouldn't be going up and turning us into the DEQ and things like that. Is like, we got way more power over you, and you shouldn't be so kind of uppity with demanding water replacement and going to the DEQ. So it was just like retribution.